All right, so now everything is going to be, held in a court of law and everything's being recorded here. And again, it is what, Tuesday, October the 7th of the year 2025. Can't believe how fast time goes, and really appreciate you all being here this morning. So, one of the things I want to mention as we get started here is that I am joined by other folks from supply chain management who will be assisting with questions throughout the presentation. So, we have a lot of information, but we also have a lot of time for Q&A. So we want to make sure that people not only get information, but more importantly, also have a chance to ask any burning questions, or even lukewarm questions are going to be great. So I want to do a big shout out to Jen Thompson, Joe Petrucci, and Crystal O'Hara, who are all here this morning and will be assisting with questions and any issues that might come up with anything I'm presenting today. And good to see you, Jen and Joe and Crystal. Thank you again for being here. So, what are we going to talk about today? Again, this is a 2 hour session, but I promise you won't have to listen to me talk for the full 2 hours. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy, so we'll make sure that there's plenty of time for some discussion too. First of all, this morning we will start with an overview of what an Aggie Enterprise requisition is. So a lot of you may already be familiar with that terminology. Some of you here may have already used that document, but we'll talk about that process, and we'll talk about the process from the start when you first want to request something all the way through to a purchase order and even payment. So a lot of times when we do training, we talk about one aspect of purchasing. We may talk about how to create an order. We may talk about how the purchase order is created, but the goal today really is to talk about the entire process from start to finish. Then we will get into catalog purchasing. There are approximately 30 catalogs now in Aggie Enterprise, and these are the full gamut of items. We've got office supplies, software, computers, we've got medical, laboratory, things I can't even pronounce in the catalogs. And so we will talk about where you can find those catalogs, but even more importantly, how to shop from them. And then for those of you who like keeping your business super local, you can also purchase from our storehouse, from our Aggie Supply Scientific store, our chemistry store, our MOR stores, directly through Aggie Enterprise. The question sometimes comes up, I love purchasing from catalogs, but what happens when the catalog doesn't have what I'm looking for? We'll talk about non-catalog purchasing as well. So this process is going to be all about like purchasing a service, purchasing items that aren't available in a catalog, that sort of thing. We'll also look at some of the other purchasing documents. One of the things that you may occasionally have come up is a supplier comes to you and says, I want you to sign this agreement. And the first thing you want to do, like in the game of Monopoly, do not pass go, do not collect 200, and do not sign that agreement. So we'll talk today about what you should do with those agreements that the vendor wants reviewed by the university. We'll also talk about how to do searches, how to make changes to purchase orders that have already been created. We will also talk about payments for those non-purchasing transactions. We'll also highlight briefly the procurement card, when you can use that. The goal of today's session is really all about resources. So I hope that today you come away not only with a better understanding of how to purchase, but even more importantly, 2 weeks from now, that you know where you can go to get information on these documents. Again, this resource, this recording will be made available to you, but there's a lot of other resources out there that are like our knowledge base articles. We have step-by-step guides, but you won't get my humor, which can either be a plus or negative depending on one's perspective. And then we will also, like I said, have plenty of time for questions and answers. In fact, as I go through each section today, I will be checking with our internal supply chain staff to see what questions are coming up, and then one of us will do our best to assist with those questions as well. And speaking of questions, like I said, we will regularly check in for any questions that come up. One of the things I do want to mention early on is that today's questions should be more in general in nature. So If you have a specific purchase order that you're having a challenge with or requisition that's been giving you problems, we encourage you to bring those types of questions to one of our virtual office hour events. So we have regular office hours. We'll talk more about those later, but we actually have those every Tuesday and Thursday at 11 a.m. to noon. And then we also have one every Wednesday morning from 10 a.m. to 10:45. And what is a virtual office hour? Basically, it's an opportunity for you to log into Zoom, kind of like we are right now, but we have breakout rooms where you can ask questions of any of our staff. So if you have a question regarding purchasing, you have a question regarding accounts payable, a question regarding a supplier record, anything like that, we have folks available on Tuesdays and Thursdays and on Wednesdays to basically help answer those specific questions. And then last but certainly not least, everything we talk about today or I talk about today is also available in our knowledge base articles. I am the person who oversees those articles. I help write them. I guess I'm kind of like the ghostwriter for better and for worse. And so those will give you all the ins and outs and all the specific situations that come up when it comes to processing your purchase documents, accounts payable, and supplier records. And it looks like, do we have a question in chat? Are we good? All right. It's just you. All right. Excellent. Sounds good. All right. So we'll go ahead and get started here. So first of all, let me go ahead. I'm going to turn my camera off now. I just wanted you to see me in case you haven't seen me before. I know some of you have worked with me in the past. In fact, I recognize a lot of people on the call today. So for those of you who I've worked with before, it's great to see you again. And if you haven't worked with me before, I apologize in advance for any bad jokes or puns that I throw into the presentation. All right, so I'm going to turn off this video now and then we'll get into the presentation itself. So again, Aggie Enterprise is the Oracle financial system. Again, it's used by UC Davis for all of tracking all of our financial activity, including purchasing. It is accessible with your campus user ID and your Kerberos password. This is the same login ID you use now for most of the systems we use here on campus. When you are purchasing something in Aggie Enterprise, it always starts with a requisition document. So a lot of times people wonder, what does a requisition mean? Basically, think of it as a request. So basically, a requisition is basically asking for permission to purchase something. We'll talk more about that permission in a moment in terms of who approves the transactions and how you can tell when a transaction has been approved or if it's been returned and that sort of thing. And then in order to purchase from Aggie Enterprise, one of the things you have to have in the system is the role of the purchasing requisition entry job role. And so a lot of you here in the call today likely already have this role. If you have any questions after today's call, or don't appear to have that role for any reason, you're not able to access what I'm showing you today, I would definitely encourage you to talk with your supervisor. But there is a new tool called the Role Access Management Tool. And this tool basically is an online system that allows you to request access to various parts of Aggie Enterprise. And then based on who you are, and what department you work for in UC Davis, it will then route to the appropriate person for their review and approval. So it's kind of a cool little tool that tracks not only who's getting access, but who is granting that access. And then other questions that come up about requisitions up front. One of those is, how does the system know who to route it to, the approval? So each time you create a requisition, one of the things you're going to be required to enter is billing information. And so there's either the project, a PPM project, which is part of the project and portfolio management system, or a charge account. And that is not only going to identify what's paying for the expense on that order, but also whose approval is needed before it can be turned into a purchase order. So this is something that happens automatically. So the good news is I can't do something bad because someone else is going to see it. So it's always good, of course, to have the conversation with your supervisor or whoever you're working with before you make the purchase. But of course, every transaction on a requisition is always going to route to the approver assigned to whatever project or account you put on that document. Now, one of the questions that will sometimes come up too is, can I put multiple accounts on there? You absolutely can. So you may have some orders that are being split, maybe amongst five different accounts. Everybody wants in on the fun as it is. And so if there are multiple approvers, then that document will require the approval of each of those approvers on each of those accounts. And then once that approval takes place, if it is a catalog order, the system automatically generates a purchase order and the order is sent off to the suppliers for fulfillment. So catalog orders are pretty slick and pretty sleek and pretty quick for the most part. If it's a non-catalog order, if there are no restricted goods, and we'll talk more about what restricted goods are, but generally speaking, these are things like controlled substances, drugs, if you're purchasing guns, I don't know if a lot of you are doing that, vehicles, things like that. Those types of things are going to require additional review by additional units here on campus. But if there are no restricted goods, or if you're not going above the automatic purchase order limit, some of you may have heard before of something called the automatic purchase order or the APO. Now, the APO limit currently is $10,000. And so, what that means is if I'm purchasing in excess of $10,000 on a non-catalog order, in general, those requisitions will be routed to and reviewed by a buyer in procurement and contracting services, and because they'll have to do additional negotiations. In some cases, they have to go out to bid, which means that they have to get multiple quotes from multiple vendors. And these are often due not only to state and federal regulations, but they are often also due to contract and grant requirements. And so these are restrictions and requirements not based on what our department wants you necessarily to have to go through, but these are requirements based on the types of goods and or services being purchased. And then the other aspect of payment has to do with what happens after the order is fulfilled. And that is, first of all, for catalog orders, the payments are automatically made as the supplier fulfills the order. So that good news with this is nothing you have to do in order to get a catalog order paid. And then, of course, the other question is, do I have to do anything to get a non-catalog order paid? And the good news is, nope. Our central accounts payable team, they are awesome. They will receive all the invoices from the suppliers automatically, and they will then manually process them and get those payments issued to those suppliers. So long story short, for Aggie Enterprise, when you're creating requisitions, either for a catalog purchase or a non-catalog purchase, you don't have to do anything to get the payments made, which is pretty cool. We like that. We're trying to make it easier for people to get what they need, and especially because all the information needed for payment is already in the system once that request is created on the requisition. One other aspect of the requisition, and I will show you this in a few moments. We're going to do a system demo, give you a chance to see the system in real time. We will be working with the test environment today, which allows me to do things without messing up anything in production, which my approvers and leadership appreciate. But the requisition preferences basically allow the user to set not only their default billing information, but also delivery location. And so what this is whatever account or shipping location you're going to use regularly. So most of you may have like a central place where you receive most of your orders. You may have like 4 or 5 different accounts that you use regularly. And so you can set these all up as preferences. Now, the good news is then you don't have to enter them each time you create a requisition. Those defaults will automatically appear and display on the requisition. So you can overwrite them as necessary, so you're not stuck with them, but it saves a lot of data entry time, and it makes people happy knowing that all those defaults are already in the system. So catalog. purchasing. Let's talk about this next, and then we're going to take a little break here before we do our system demo to see what questions or comments you have so far. So there are currently about 35 catalogs in Aggie Enterprise. Again, we've got office, computer, medical, laboratory, scientific, custodial, software items, and more in these catalogs. It's amazing how many times people will come to me and say, I'm looking for something and I can't find it. And believe it or not, it's in one of those catalogs in Aggie Enterprise. So we definitely encourage you to always start with a catalog purchase. It is the best and it's the easiest way to purchase both supplies and capital assets. What is a capital asset? It's something that's at or above the a dollar amount of $5,000, a standalone item, and it has a useful life of a year or longer. Sometimes you may hear these referred to also as equipment, and capital assets are tracked by our friends over in the equipment management department here at UC Davis. So you can purchase those items as well in Aggie Enterprise through the catalog. So you can purchase something that's $1.50 or $150,000 in a catalog, which is pretty cool. The purchases in the catalogs are covered under the terms and conditions of the applicable university agreement. The benefits to you include often free or reduced cost shipping. They often include better warranties than you're going to get from the public facing site. And they also generally give you better return terms. So people will sometimes say, I noticed that Aggie Enterprise item is a little bit more expensive than what I see on the public facing site. And that may be true. But the problem is the item on the public facing site may have a shipping charge. It may also not have as good warranty terms, and there may be a cost in returning it if there's a problem. So keep in mind that the sticker price or the price you see online, like in the catalog, only tells part of the story. You're getting a lot of benefits and additional coverage and protection when you are purchasing from one of the catalogs. No dollar limits for purchase. This one's really cool too. So what this means is that, again, if you want to purchase $800,000 worth of supplies, you can do that. Now, I won't stop you. My supervisor won't stop you. Our department won't stop you. Now, your account manager might stop you if you don't have the budget for that much supplies or equipment. But there's no system requirement that you can only purchase up to a certain amount. The prices, again, are the best ones offered to the university by that particular supplier. Now, a brief advertisement. We are going to have our UC Davis Supplier Show, and this is going to be coming up on October 29th, which is a little over 3 weeks from now, which is hard for me to believe, but that's true. Just 3 weeks from tomorrow. And this will be from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. at the Activities and Recreation Center, or the ARC, on the campus. There will be multiple vendors. I believe we have close to 30 vendors going to be at the event. We also have breakout sessions. We will have breakout sessions on things including covered services. We're not going to get into a heavy conversation on that today because that could be a whole conversation in and of itself. But covered services, how to deal with unauthorized purchases. We've got Fisher Scientific doing a presentation, Eppendorf doing a presentation. So if you want to learn more about our catalog suppliers, I would love to see you all there at the UC Davis Supplier Show coming up on the 29th of this month. And we're going to do a demo next. And as I bring up the test environment, I'm going to take a break here, take a sip of coffee, and then also see if anybody has any questions. There will be a brief delay here as I get the test environment going. Looks like my screen is showing. Everybody looking good here. All right. So this is the test environment of Oracle or Aggie Enterprise. Again, this is the environment you'll be using for purchasing. But again, we are in the test environment. So basically the main difference between test and production is that test is where we do all of our pre-deployment work. We also, look at things if there's a problem in the system, that sort of thing. So this is the home page. So when you first log into Aggie Enterprise, you'll be at the home page. Anytime you want to get back to this page, you can click on the little home icon to bring you back to the home page. At the top of the screen, there are various modules. One of those is procurement. And when I click on procurement, which I'm already at, I can see the various document tiles here. There's one for purchase requisitions. There's also purchase agreements, purchase orders, my receipts, and suppliers. So for most of you, the majority of your time will be spent creating requests, and so you'll be spending most of your time in purchase requisitions. This is your gateway to all the purchases within the system. So this takes you to what's known as the self-service procurement screen. And for those of you who have already been in Aggie Enterprise before about 2 weeks ago, you know that there was a recent update to the look and feel. So for some of you, if this is your first entry into Aggie Enterprise, well, this will be what it has always looked like. But for those of you who have been on the Aggie Enterprise journey, going all the way back to January of 2024, back in the good old days, it had a slightly different look and feel. So what I want to show you first, before we create any requisitions, any purchases, is that preference screen. So I mentioned earlier, there is a preference option, and you'll notice it right here in the upper right corner. This is where a user can go to enter not only their delivery information, but also their billing information. So this is an important screen for a couple of reasons. One is it's where I identify here where I want my delivery to go. So in this case here, I want my deliveries to go on campus to the Hoagland Annex, room number 110. And then I also have an account down below that I want to use for this specific preference screen. Now you'll notice there's a plus icon here, so I can add multiple accounts if I want. So again, I'm not limited to having just one default. A lot of you may be lucky enough to have just one or two defaults, but of course some of you may, manage, have like your own shared service thing going on where you've got multiple units you're supporting, and so you may want to set up all those accounts in the system ahead of time. One important consideration, this is the one that will bite you if you're not careful. So it's the requisitioning BU field. Now, what the heck is a requisitioning BU? It's not a medical condition. It actually stands for Requisition Business Unit. And so what you want to do is when you're searching here, you'll notice there's two options. There's UCD Business Unit and there's UCD REQ Business Unit. You always want to make sure that you have this set to the REQ business unit. If you have the other option selected, you don't get to do hardly anything. You'll go to the procurement screen. Most of the catalogs won't be there. You'll try to make a purchase. You'll keep getting error messages. It will make you feel very grumpy. And I would share in your grumpiness because it's no fun to try to purchase when the system's not letting you do it. So you'll want to make sure that your requisitioning BU field is set to the UCD Rec business unit option. You only have to do this one time. And then of course, once you click on update, any updates you've made will then apply to any requisitions you create after that point. So that's our preferences. You can go back anytime to make updates. The very first time you log into Aggie Enterprise, you will be required to enter those preferences. So don't worry about forgetting to do that. The system won't let you pass go or collect $200 until you have actually done that. Down below, you'll notice a few things on the screen here. One is there's news. There's a little news section, kind of gives you some of our current updates. You'll notice we've got some advertising here for our office hours, our websites. So again, if there's a system problem, we try to hopefully don't have those too often, but occasionally, as any system, there could be a downtime or something. We'll let you know what's going on. If there are any new catalogs, we will advertise those here in the news section or anything else that we think will be helpful to our purchasers. And then down below, this is where it gets fun. In the case you weren't already having fun, there is the shop by category section. So you'll see here, there's all the different sections you can purchase it from. So there's a non-catalog forms, and we're going to take a look at that one in a bit. But for the catalogs, you'll notice there's punch outs for furniture, MRO. For the uninitiated, by the way, I didn't know this when I first started working. It is maintenance, repair, and operations. So those kinds of items. So in case you were wondering what a MRO was, there's also life science catalogs. There is IT, office equipment, that sort of thing. We also have our central storehouse, our chemistry storehouse, scientific storehouse, and our mail storehouse. So you can purchase from all those as well. What the heck is a punch out, though, you might be asking? Punch out basically just means that you're going to be going to an external vendor site to do the shopping and then return those items back into Aggie Enterprise. So effectively, you're punching out of our system, and I guess in effect, punching into another system, and then you bring those items back. Now, it sounds like a lot of physical labor involved, but luckily it's all taken care of by the internet and by the system itself. So let me show you a sample here of how it works. So for instance, let's say my supervisors come to me and we're getting ready to start a new lab. We're going to do a new lab on campus. And so we need some beakers. So I'm going to click on the life science punch outs. This will take me to the page that has a list of all the suppliers that basically serve those types of products or specialize in those products. You'll see companies like Abcam, Amerisource Bergen, Biorad, Sativa, Eppendorf, Eurofins Genomics, Fisher Scientific. And then to go to any one of these, you'll see there's a little go to site button. I just click that. And that's now going to effectively punch out from the Aggie Enterprise system into the portal for that particular vendor. So now I'm in the Fisher Scientific site. And again, this is their website specifically for us here at UC Davis. So this is not the same site you would see if you go to the public facing Fisher Scientific site. I can type in what I'm looking for. Like let's say here, I'm looking for a beaker and then do a search here to see what comes up. The various results will appear. If I want to order some of them, I can click on pricing and availability on one of these options. Again, let's say I want to buy a pack of 12 there. I click on a quantity of 1. And then I'm going to click on the option to add to my cart. Now, keep in mind, I'm still in the punch out site, so I can add multiple items from a punch out site at one time. And we can also combine multiple punch outs if we want. From here, if I'm happy with that, that's all I want at this time. I can click on the view cart option. Again, I'm still in the punch out. And then I just basically review what I've got here. And then I'm going to click on the button to return the cart to the purchasing application. So what this is going to do now is take me back from Fisher back to Aggie Enterprise. There will be a momentary delay here as the system is doing some processing behind the scenes. We keep our fingers crossed that all is well. Again, I am in the test environment, so this environment can be a little bit more laggy. That's my word anyway, than the production environment. Usually production is pretty quick. And of course, while we're all staring at the screen, it will go slower too. So there you go. So now it's brought it back to my cart. So now the item that I just returned from the Fisher Scientific item catalog is in the cart. You'll notice down below, there is the item. You'll also notice there are options on the screen for making edits. You can make edits to things like the account information. You can make edits to delivery information. But if you don't change anything, the defaults you already have set up. So in other words, the default of the Hoagland Annex Room 110 and my default account will be the ones that will be used for this requisition. So I don't have to change anything unless there's a reason to. I am good to go. A couple other things I want to mention at this point. You can come back to a cart later. So if I wanted to submit this now, I could. But if I want to wait until later and I want to add more items to it, I can also do that. So you have plenty of options available. This often becomes a very personal decision. People often have strong opinions. So I've worked with some departments where people will submit requisitions, 5 days a week. Other people will combine items over several days and place an order once a week. Whatever works best for you is what works best for you. So you want to talk to your department if you've got any preferences in terms of how often you want to place orders and that sort of thing. But you can place a single item order if you want, or you can also place a multi-line order. I guess in terms of sustainability, though, I do like to mention that placing an order with more items is preferable in terms of reducing the trips and delivery options. So, from a sustainability standpoint, having less frequent requisitions, I guess, can be an advantage for reducing a carbon footprint. So, let me go ahead and click on submit because this is going to do a couple of things. It's going to make sure that what I've entered is good. It's also going to let me know if I've forgotten to enter anything. And there could be some things I've forgotten. So this is going to be a good test. And I think I know what it might tell me to do. It wants me to put in a description. This is a very important field. The description field identifies why I'm creating this order. So lab beaker for new Chem 101 lab for Dr. Smith. So you want to identify how the purchase supports teaching, research, university, public service, or patient care. Keep in mind, this is one of the fields the auditors really like. So it's always good to make sure that the field that the auditor likes is one that you're giving full, complete information to. It's also important because if someone comes back a week from now and asks you, why did you create that requisition on October the 7th of 2025? You can say, oh yeah, that was the new beaker for Dr. Smith's new Chemistry 101 lab. So I like having it there because I consider it self-preservation. Otherwise, I will forget. If you ask me why I did something 2 hours ago, I'm likely to forget. If you ask me what I had for breakfast an hour ago, I've already moved on. So always good to document everything because it will help not only you, but also help your approvers. Let's click on submit again. And now we're going to see if it likes everything. Take a look down below. It looks like it's good there. And it gave me a confirmation message that is good. And so each time things are good, it will give you a little message in green, a little pop-up. And again, if anything's missing, it will let you know with a little red box there what needs to be addressed. So that is a catalog purchase. Again, that was just a sample catalog purchase for Fisher Scientific. Some of you may end up using that catalog. Some of you may never use that catalog. But each of the punch outs works similarly. Again, you'll just click on the Go to Site button to take you to that catalog. And then more importantly, you'll be able to then shop that catalog, return those items, and then click on Submit. For most people, if you've worked with any type of online service before, I know a lot of you probably have purchased from Amazon or eBay or Etsy or some of these other online sellers or resellers. A lot of Aggie Enterprise is very similar to that. So the good news is once you've kind of done a few of these, you'll probably feel fairly comfortable in terms of how the process works. The main difference, of course, between your personal purchasing and university purchasing, though, is that these purchases will always go to an approver. So again, now that I clicked on submit, let's say my boss, Crystal, was actually the approver on that. She could then either approve it or she could return it or reject it. So approve basically means that everything's good. It means it's been given the blessing to go on to being fulfilled. Reject means, again, do not pass go. We don't want you to purchase this. And then return basically means I want you to make some changes. So approvers generally can't edit the transaction. So once the requisition's been submitted to the approver, they can look at it and go, wow, that's a great requisition. Or they can go, oh my, that's not so great. And so if they feel like it's less than great, they can return it and then changes can be made by the initiator. Now, keep in mind that email notifications are sent out for this. So approvers get email notifications. You will get an email notification once the requisition has been approved. You will get an email notification if the requisition has been returned to you. So there are automated system notifications that are generated by Aggie Enterprise for the various types of transactions. We do have a web page as well that talks about each of the notifications, when it gets sent, as well as who it gets sent to. So let me go ahead and go back now to the demo of the PowerPoint here for a moment. And before I go any further, let me just make sure that all is well here. Let me check in with my folks now to see if there are any questions. And how are we looking right now, folks?
There have been questions, but Marcus can't and Jen are answering.
Okay, well, very good. Well, I will do a big shout out to both Mark and Jen. And then, of course, if any of my folks have any questions that need additional clarification, please let me know that as well. But I guess at this point, then, we'll move on to part two, which is non-catalog purchasing. So, catalog purchasing, fairly straightforward in the sense that what you see is what you get. Non-catalog is what you're going to do for most service procurement because the catalogs generally only have goods. They don't generally have services you can purchase. They're also used for blanket purchasing request. And for the uninitiated, what the heck is a blanket purchase request? I mean, it sounds like I'm buying a blanket. And that may be appropriate considering that we're getting to that cooler time of the year. But a blanket purchase request generally is when you have an ongoing purchasing need. So an example here might be for a department where you've got, let's say, 2 labs of nothing but centrifuges. And you need those centrifuges calibrated on a regular basis by an outside supplier. So a request for ongoing service can also be made on a non-catalog request. There are 2 different types of requisitions for non-catalog: quantity-based or fixed price. And so quantity-based is kind of like what you're going to see most of the time for anything measured in a unit. 4, each pencils, 4 buckets of paint, 4 gallons of milk, that sort of thing. A fixed price request is where the price is fixed regardless of the good or service being provided. So this could be a situation where, let's say I'm purchasing a manuscript editing service for $250. So whether it takes them 20 minutes to do the editing or it takes them 22 hours, they're still only billing us a flat rate of $250. The only reason I mention this is because when you go to choose a requisition in Aggie Enterprise, you have to choose either quantity-based or fixed price. So I wanted to make sure that it was clear what the differences are between those 2. And then we go to the screen here. Oops, sorry, move on. There, let's see, I did all that. This is my nuance screen, which is important. So this is the most important point I want to make here. Non-catalog purchasing. So I'm going to show you in a moment a basic non-catalog purchase. There are a lot of nuances. So my example here will be fairly straightforward because I want to show you how the system works, show you the ins and outs of the document. But keep in mind that our knowledge base article goes into the weeds on a lot of different options that will come up. So if I'm being asked to purchase a $250,000 centrifuge machine or something like that, the requirements for that are going to be a lot different than purchasing office supplies for one of our labs. So keep in mind that the nuances often are more regulatory than they are system driven. So the good news is once you basically understand how to do the requisition, this part will be pretty easy. Dealing with the federal and state and other regulatory agencies, that can be the bigger challenge. But luckily for you and luckily for me as well, I won't be getting into all that today because I'm not qualified, nor will I pretend to be qualified in that department. But the reason I mention any of this is because there will be requests that require specific documentation. Keep in mind on the requisition, there are notes and attachment sections for adding documentation. We also have a guide that talks about all the different scenarios where you might need to send attachments. Some of these include things like purchasing software that's not on an agreement. There are situations if you're purchasing a capital asset, equipment items, there are additional requirements for that. If you're purchasing certain types of things over a certain dollar amount, so like if you're on a federally funded transaction, if it's over $10,000, there's additional documentation that's required in most cases. And so these documents can be electronically attached directly to the requisition at the time you create it. Let's demo a non-catalog purchase now, but before we do that, it sounds like Crystal has a question.
There's a few questions in
Yeah.
the chat. Maybe
Okay.
you could read them out loud.
Oh, sure.
I can do that too.
All right. So let's see. What are we looking at here, Crystal?
I'll do it.
All right.
Okay, we have a couple of questions I'm hoping some of my colleagues can respond to. One of them is from Teresa, and she's asking about what if you have a combination of a fixed price and a service? So I'm hoping someone, maybe Mark Gibson, can help us with that.
Yeah, so I just replied, you could combine both options when you're creating a requisition basing on the different lines. It's most common you're going to see this on one-time purchases where I'm buying a piece of equipment, which is going to be your quantity-based item, and then I have a year's worth of on-call service contract is what I put in here, where it's fixed price, where we don't know what the on-call service is going to cost each time that you call them in. But if this is, we've kind of found that for blanket agreements, or not blanket agreements, blanket purchase orders, new process, it's best to use fixed price because sometimes the prices can be variable throughout the year. So if you're trying to do it for the year, put it in as a fixed price for the full amount for the year. Does that help, Teresa?
Yeah, thank you. We can certainly do that. I mean, the price stays the same. We just never know how many of them we're going to use, but we can certainly do it a fixed price. Thank you.
Yep.
And Paul also has a question. If I have a one-line item quote for a single price, is that fixed or quantity? Or a multi-line item quote, but that only has a single final price and not a per item price?
For the one item quote, that would be it's one item, one each. Just do that as a quantity. We shouldn't be seeing a price, and that will actually trigger AP to review it. If it's over a certain dollar threshold to go, wait, why is this changing? That way we have a quote, we want them to honor it. If they're trying to change it after the fact, that's not a good thing. And then on the multi-line item quote, but they only have one price, the fixed price is good just in case they, which is allows us to pay. It's the best option because it allows you to pay as they charge us. If they happen to go, oh, we're sending line 1 and 5 and not 2, 3, and 4, those will come later.
Great. Thank you, Mark.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else? All right. Thanks, everyone. Great questions. It sounds like some of you have already been doing some transactions within Aggie Enterprise based on some of those questions. And yeah, you can definitely have some interesting scenarios. And those are great questions, by the way, because if you have any of those kind of problems that come up, especially after today's session, those are the kinds of things where we can definitely assist at office hours, where we can take a look at your specific situation to figure out the best course of action. So I'm back now in the self-service procurement screen in Aggie Enterprise. So now I want to do a non-catalog request. You'll notice down below there is a non-catalog form section. Click on this. And then you're going to see the various options appear. Again, there's the quantity and the fixed price-based requisitions. You'll notice there's also a few other forms in this section. There are options for adding a new line to an existing PO. So these are the situations when a purchase order has already been created and there's a reason to make a modification, or in this case, to add a new line after that purchase order has already been created. You'll notice that there's also a few documents on the screen for agreement review. I talked about those a bit earlier. These are the documents used when the vendor is coming to you with a legal document to sign. So if a vendor comes to you with a legal document requiring a university signature, Don't sign it. Don't let your supervisor sign it. Don't let your favorite faculty member sign it. Don't let anybody sign it, but make sure that you create the request here to upload that form directly to Aggie Enterprise, and then the appropriate buyer within procurement and contracting services will review it and sign it on behalf of the university. This is to protect all of us. So I don't want to sign something because I don't want to be legally responsible, let's say, for something that the university really should be legally responsible. So if the vendor asks you to sign a credit agreement, they ask you to sign terms and conditions, definitely make sure that you send those over on the appropriate agreement review document. Now, for this example, what I'm about to show you is how to do a non-catalog request, a new one, and we're going to do a quantity-based request. And so when you go to the screen, you'll like the fact it's not too complicated. There's really not a lot you have to fill in. But what you want to do is make sure that the information you have is complete in order to make the request. So item description, this is where you're going to indicate specifically what it is you want to purchase. So for those of you out there who don't know me well, I am a cat person. I'm a cat guy. My cat is named Roger. He's 10 years old. Some of you already probably know the backstory, but I'm going to do an example of purchasing a cat tree. That's the reason I'm giving you that backstory. So we want to purchase a cat tree from a company called Cats R Us. That's the manufacturer, and the model number is going to be and it's going to be ZZZ. And let's see here. And we've got item number 345. So what you want to do in the item description is put all the basic information as to what it is you are purchasing. So again, manufacturer, model, part number. Most of the time when you're purchasing, you will probably be working off of a website or some, email or something. So feel free to copy and paste directly into that field. You also will notice that there's a character count here. So I have 188 more characters that I could add here before I would reach the maximum. Line type is quantity. Category, this is where you're going to identify what this particular item falls under. So I know I've got some vintage employees on this call. I put myself in the vintage category as well. For those of us who've been around even in the days before the system known as DAFUS. So if you've been here that long, you've been here a heck of a long time. And so we had commodity codes back in the day. Aggie Enterprise does not use commodity codes, which is great. We use categories now. And so what you want to do is find one that's appropriate or closely related to what it is you're purchasing. So in this case here, I've got animal cages, habitats, animal handling items. I'm going to use this one here because this falls under the category of accessories for animal stuff. Quantity, this is going to be how many trees I want. I'm going to get 3. UOM could stand for University of Michigan, but in this case, it stands for unit of measure. And again, you'll notice if you click on that, it is searchable, and there's all different ways that units can be measured. Price, these are going to be $45.67 each. Currency will default to US dollars. Down below is where you identify the source. So where are you purchasing this from? So I know I've got, again, some folks on the call that have already been using Aggie Enterprise or used Koali or even DAFUS for you longtime people. So we do have agreements in the system. So what an agreement basically is a university negotiation between an outside vendor and the buyer team here in procurement and contracting services. So whatever an agreement's available, we encourage you to use it. You can do a search for agreements right here, and then you can enter that number if it is applicable for your particular purchase. In this particular purchase, the assumption is I've already looked. I've been looking for a company called Catamorphic, but I noticed that there's no agreement for them in the system. So if I can't find the agreement I'm looking for in the system, that's okay. Then what I'm going to do is move out of that field and move to the supplier field and then enter what I want to purchase, who I want to purchase from. So I'm going to do a search here. I find the vendor Catamorphic. I click on that name there. Now a couple of things will happen. And sometimes people won't even notice these. They're a bit subtle. One is the supplier site. This is the default address for that particular vendor. So every vendor in the system has a default address. And when I say default, you'll notice it says DF before the address on the supplier site. DF stands for default. Some vendors may have multiple addresses. If you click on the drop down there, you'll see that it then displays the actual address for this vendor, which happens to be in Oakland, California. Now, we won't get into all the details of this today, but there is an offline process or a different process outside of Aggie Enterprise for uploading new vendors. It's called Payment Works. Some of you may have heard of Payment Works. Payment Works is the system that we're now using here at UC Davis that allows us to both onboard new suppliers as well as make updates to existing records. So in order to use a supplier at Aggie Enterprise, the record has to be there. Now, there's also a supplier contact. Some vendors may have a contact listed. A lot of them don't. You don't have to worry about that. Again, supplier item, optional field, you don't need to fill that one out either. As long as you've got all the description up above, you are good to go. Now, we get down to the random notes and attachments. You'll notice here this says note to supplier. So the way the note to supplier works is that if you type something in this field, it will appear on the PDF version of the purchase order. So what happens is if you email a copy of the PDF, what they'll see on there is their note to supplier on the homepage of that PDF. So if you've got something specific you want to tell the supplier, you can put that there. In all honesty, that the field doesn't get used very often. There's also the attachments. Now, this does get used when you are making purchases that require additional review and approval, especially by a buyer in procurement and contracting services. The category will default to miscellaneous, which is the category that's the best one to use. So leave that as the default. And then you can click here to then find whatever it is that you want to upload. You'll see here it brings up all the things on my screen, which I don't want to upload right now, so I can cancel out of there. But that's basically where you would go to upload any attachments. You can also type in a website if you want. So if you got this price from, toysrs.com or thebestlabsupplies.com, you could type that website there and then click the button to add that. So you've got a reference as to where that price came from. So that's the basic information that's required for a quantity-based requisition. And then from here, what I do is I add it to my cart by clicking on the Add to Cart button. Again, there will be a momentary delay while it processes that. And then if I click on View Cart, it will then bring up that item in the cart. And then just like before, if I wanted to continue the process, I could just go back to self-service procurement and then add another item. So I can add multiple items, repeat this process over and over again if I'd like. If I want to have, let's say, not only a cat tree, but I want a cat bed. I want, I'm trying to think what else my cat wants. A warm blanket, security, peace, love, and understanding. My cat wants a lot of things that may not be available in all those catalogs. But in any case, once you've added everything you want, then you would do like before, where you would click on submit. The system will perform that final edit check. Again, I do have that item or the description for the system itself. So cat tree for cat study on REM sleep in cats. So again, you always want to make sure you put as much information as possible because this is what the auditors look at. And again, it's also good information that makes it easier for your approvers to take action. Like I always tell folks, I don't think there's been too many documents that have been returned due to too much information. There have been some that have been returned due to not enough information. So if you're going to err on the side of one way or the other, always good to put more information than too little. Then click on submit. And again, the system will then do a final edit check, make sure that all the accounts are good. And then from there, it will go through the routing process as well. Now, this requisition because I used the same account, the same default I had from before, means this one will route to the same individual that the previous one routed to. So it doesn't make any difference whether I'm purchasing catalog items or non-catalog items. The routing is going to be based on the account I'm using, as well as whether or not the dollar amount is over or under that automatic purchase order limit of $10,000. So at this point, I'm going to stop again before I go back to the PowerPoint to see if we have any questions.
There are quite a few questions.
There are. Well, that's great.
Okay, we've got quite a few questions right now. Is there a way for Aggie Enterprise to include a short description of the field or acronyms above the typing area to help guide the user? Like defining UOM and, hold on.
So the question was regarding the unit of measure and so forth and the acronyms?
The acronyms,
Yeah.
help with the acronyms.
Absolutely. So we do have a catalog, or I should say in our step-by-step guide, we do have the information on what each of those acronyms stand for.
Okay, then another question about attachment section be used to attach files like Appendix DS for IT purchases? Absolutely, that's what it's there for.
Great. Yeah, that was a good question regarding the Appendix DS. That is something that can be attached. That's great. The only things you shouldn't be attaching really are things that are either personal health information or things that would be like credit card numbers. You would never want to display a full credit card number or someone's private health information.
If you have several items from the same vendor, do you just add additional lines in the item description?
Yeah, so for additional items, what you would do is you would go back to the self-service procurement button, and then you would repeat the process again to add another item.
How do you add tax to a PO line item and verify that the item line is set up as taxable or non-tax taxable? Are you able to pick sales tax versus use tax?
Great questions on the tax. The system will automatically calculate the tax based on the commodity as well as the delivery location. So if you're having something delivered, let's say to San Francisco versus something being delivered to Sacramento, they each have different tax rates, which means that the system will calculate the tax rate accordingly. The system is only calculating sales tax. It won't be calculating use tax. So theoretically, if I'm purchasing from a vendor from out of state that doesn't collect California sales tax, your department will be responsible for making that payment to the state separately.
Jim, actually, the
Yeah.
system should be calculating the use tax. I think.
Oh, it is? Okay, great, Mark.
Yeah, I think what happens is there is a taxable amount that will help you confirm what is going to be there, and
Oh, great. Okay.
add it as a self-assessed tax when we pay the invoice.
Perfect. Sounds good. Other questions? Great questions, by the way. And good questions again, too, regarding information on the taxes is addressed in the step-by-step guides, which we'll talk about those a little bit later. And again, all the various acronyms, because there are a lot of them out there. I know that it's kind of can feel like alphabet soup sometimes when you're new to the system. So the step-by-step guides will always define each of the acronyms and what each of those acronyms stands for.
What do you do to change a requisition that was approved for less than 10K to more than 10K, needed more services than expected?
What'll happen in the case if it's under 10K and the change takes it above 10K is those will automatically route to the buyer and procurement. So the system will automatically address that issue. Luckily, that doesn't happen too often. Anything else? Great questions, by the way. Sounds like some of you have already been playing in the system quite a bit, which is great. All right, well, we'll continue on and we can go back to my PowerPoint. Just doing a time check here. It is about 10 o'clock. And like I said, you don't have to listen to me for another full hour. I will probably be done in about another 30 minutes or so to allow plenty of time for more questions and answers. Let me go back to our PowerPoint here. So again, talked about this a little bit, but I do want to review this. Again, the agreement review documents are those used to submit vendor agreements where the vendor is asking for a university approved signature. Only the buyers in procurement and contracting services are authorized to sign those agreements on behalf of the university. So again, this is such an important point. I always like to make it multiple times because some people still feel like they have the authority and you don't want that authority. So this is this sometimes having the authority can be the good thing, but in this case, that authority would only cause headaches and heartaches, and you don't want either one of those. The add new line documents are used to add an additional item to a previously created purchase order. So again, you notice there was a couple of documents called add new line to an existing PO. And then one other document that's a little outside of the scope for today, but I do want to mention it because it's there. And if any of you work in this area, it's good to know. There is a revenue agreement document. So everything we're talking about today is where money is leaving the university. So we're, paying for a service, we're paying for a good. So some outside entity is providing goods or services in exchange for us paying them money. A revenue agreement is complete opposite of that. So that is where the university is actually the business that the person is buying from. So we become basically the business where, and this could be some departments on campus that may sell like agricultural items or supplies, seeds, plant products, things like that. So the revenue agreement document is used to create an agreement where your department is providing a good or service to an outside entity for income. So we have a whole step-by-step guide in that process that gets into the whole accounts receivable process. So to clarify, accounts payable, where again, we're paying the bills for things that we owe money to, is under the jurisdiction of the department I work in, which is supply chain management. Revenue agreements, we set them up, but the actual process of collecting the income and so forth is considered accounts receivable. And that process is actually overseen by the finance department here at UC Davis. So we're kind of like cousins, or I guess we're first cousins now. I think for a while we might have been second cousins, but now I think we're back to being first cousins again. So we work closely with finance in terms of those processes as well. Now, again, talked about that one already. I guess did I have that one twice? Or wait a minute, let me go back. Really wanted to make sure those nuances were created and accounted for directly there. There we go. Let's move on to this one now. Requisition and purchase order searches. All right, so here we go. So you've created some requisitions. I've created some requisitions. You want to see where they are in the system. If they've been approved, if they've been denied, maybe I want to look up someone else's requisitions. I want to look at their purchase orders. The good news is with the system, we have what's known as a My Requisition screen, which is kind of a weird name screen because actually you can look at anybody's requisitions. So you can look at your requisitions, but you're not limited to only seeing yours. So I can see requisitions that you've created. You can look at ones that I've created. You can look at ones that your colleagues have created. Basically, it's information that can help you. And the reason that access is available is because there may be situations where somebody's filling in or a backup for someone else. So maybe I'm the primary purchasing person for my department, but the next 2 weeks I'm going to be on vacation. And so, during those 2 weeks, the business of the university doesn't stop. And so my backup can then go in and take a look at what I've created. The good news is not only can they see the status of my requisitions, but there's also options for creating a template from those. So theoretically, if I need to place another order for the same thing, I can actually find a pre-existing requisition. And then there's a duplicate option that allows me to create a brand new requisition from the existing one, which is pretty cool. The searches in the system are dynamic, which means that it's almost like that children's book that I used to love as a kid. Even as an adult, it's still kind of cool. Choose Your Own Adventure, where you can search by not only your username, but also by a supplier name, a requisition number, and a lot of other criteria. So let's go back into Aggie Enterprise and let's take a look at a few searches here, and I'll show you some of the information that these screens will provide to you in the system itself. So you'll notice the search screen is at the very bottom. So keep in mind that all the stuff I've been doing today has been either here in the self-service procurement area. The cart will always show you whatever's currently in your cart. Right now, there's no number there, which means the cart is currently empty. And then my requisitions is where you can search for anything. And when I say anything, literally anything that is a requisition. So you'll notice right now, by default, the screen does bring up my requisitions. So I think that's the reason they decided to call it that, is because the default setting is the ones I personally created. Now you'll notice it shows you the requisition number. It shows you the description. It also shows you the date. It also shows you the status. Now you'll notice here, there are some that are pending approval. There are some that say draft. Now the difference between pending approval means it's waiting for an approver to take action. Draft means it's still in cart. So I still have not submitted that one. So that one is still sitting out there somewhere. And in this case, that one was created a long time ago, so that may be why it's not showing here in my particular cart situation. But let me go back and actually show you some more dynamic ones that are going to give you a little bit more information. So let me do a search on Fisher Scientific, since that's one of our vendors here that we do a lot of business with. And let me see what I can find here in this. Here we go. Now we're going to get some hits. So you're going to notice here, first of all, ones that were canceled will be identified as such, canceled. So you'll notice here it says canceled, it's red. Ordered means the order has been placed. Now, anytime it says ordered, not only will it say ordered, but if you go to the little ellipsis or the three dots over here, there should be an option for viewing the order itself. So click here and click on view order, and this should bring up the actual order that was placed based on the parameters of that requisition. Again, this can take a little bit of time. We're in the test environment, which tends to be a little more laggy, is the word I like to use. Or maybe it just went out on a coffee break. Let's see here. It's still thinking. All right, we'll give it a little bit of time to think. So there we go. We got it. All right, so we've got our information here on the purchase order. You'll see it gives you all kinds of information. Now you'll notice that this particular one is actually a punch out catalog order. And the reason I can tell is because look where it says supplier site. It says punch out only. That means that particular order I'm looking at is one that was placed in the Fisher Scientific punch out catalog. You'll notice it also includes the dollar amount ordered. It breaks out the amount ordered as well as the tax amount. So in this case, the total on this order is $67.28. We've got our description or business purpose. Again, we're in the test environment, so that business purpose would not pass the audit test. I will make that clear right up front. But when we're doing test documents, we don't have to worry about the audits because these are not real transactions. You'll also notice any shipping terms down below. If it's a repair or service, you'll notice information here that will identify where the repair or service is taking place. If it's applicable for our Small Business First program, there will be information there. And then the specifics as to what were ordered will be listed down here. So it looks like this is some type of a vial, a screw cap vial, one pack of a screw cap, let me say it more clearly, a vial for $62.73. And let me go back here for a moment. We also have, let's see if I've got any that are, we've got a few more of those draft ones. So again, I can scroll down and see all kinds of status information here on these. Again, in addition to the ordered, you can also view more details if you want to see the details in a different screen this way. This will show you additional information. So you'll notice that some of these will just break it out by, like here, it gives you the subtotals, the dollar amounts based on the different lines, that sort of thing. So I encourage people, once we're done with today's session, to go back and kind of play with these a little bit. You know, you don't have to do just the options I'm showing you here on this demo. There are a lot of different ways you can get information in the system. You can view the document history here. Again, that might take a moment to come up. we are in the test environment. Like I said, it can take a little bit longer here. So this will show you who took action on the requisition, because sometimes people want to know who submitted it. So in this case here, it was submitted by Marcy, and then Matt approved it. And then the actual PO that's associated with this order was submitted by our buyer, Aaron Lasado. So again, this kind of gives you the whole workflow of that particular document. So document history is where you can go anytime you want to know who's involved in the approval of a document, a transaction, as well as any buyers that are involved with that particular transaction. So one thing I do want to mention too regarding the buyers is the buyers are not involved with any catalog orders. So the way Aggie Enterprise works is even on a catalog order, it will show the name of a buyer. If you have any questions, problems, concerns with a catalog order, you always want to go back specifically to that catalog provider. So in other words, if I buy something from Fisher and it's damaged or it's not working up to expectations and so forth, I want to contact Fisher directly and then work with them to, get that order issue resolved. Contacting the buyer will not generally help you because the buyer is not involved with the catalog orders. The main time you would want to contact a buyer for a problem is if it's an order that was placed by that buyer. So for instance, if you're purchasing like certain scientific items and so forth, a lot of those orders will route for approval and negotiation by Daisy Tom or Aaron Lasado, who are two of our scientific buyers. And so if one of them was involved with the actual purchase on the purchase order, then they'll definitely be able to assist you with questions and problems that come up. So just wanted to mention that because sometimes our buyers will get questions about a catalog order. And although they want to help you as much as they can, normally they can't add much value to those questions. Generally speaking, you'll get the best response directly from the vendor that provided that particular item. So that's the search. Again, I just did a search by vendor name, but again, I can do a search by a person's name, like one of my coworkers here. It brings up the part of the name. I can click on the name there, and then it will bring up specifically all the requisitions that were entered by Matt. Again, I can also search by a particular date, status. So this is a field that allows you to do a lot of different types of searches. For what it's worth, we also have a video out there that I will show you briefly that has kind of a demo on this as well. So it will show you a lot of additional ways that you can search for requisitions in Aggie Enterprise. So you can even search by dollar amount if you want. If you wanted to see all transactions that were exactly $750.98. But there definitely are a lot of great ways to get that information. And this is the other big topic I know that comes up because life happens when we're busy, making other plans, right? So if I need to make a change to a requisition, I can withdraw the document and make changes. As I mentioned earlier, an approver cannot directly make edits. So in my case earlier, there was a document where Marcy submitted it and then Matt approved it. If Matt had problems with the requisition, he noticed a typo or the wrong item being ordered, he couldn't edit it, but he could return it back to the initiator. So the initiator, or the approver, I should say, has an option to not only approve a transaction, but also to return it. Keep in mind that not only do we have information and guides out there for all of you that are submitting these documents, but I know at least a few of you on the call today may be in the approver role. We actually have a step-by-step guide for approvers as well. And we actually have a short training module too, about 10-minute training module about all the things you can or can't do as an approver. So if any of you are approvers out there, I would encourage you not only to learn as much as you can about the submission process in terms of creating and submitting a requisition, but also take that training, and I'll show you the resources before the end of the session today, because that will really help you better understand what powers you have available to you as an approver. Once a purchase order is issued, any required changes are made to the associated requisition. So you have to find the original requisition, and you could do that through that screen we looked at earlier. And then once those changes have been approved, they will apply to that purchase order. When it comes to making changes, the very best time to make changes is before the purchase order is issued. Um, I've been here now for about 30 years, and each system we've had has had challenges when it comes to making it easy to make change orders. Unfortunately, with Oracle and Aggie Enterprise, it's still a fairly complicated process. It was complicated in DAFUS. For those of you who remember the change order process with DAFUS, it was complicated in Kowali. Unfortunately, it's also fairly complicated in Aggie Enterprise. So, as much as possible, try to minimize any changes once a purchase order has been issued. They do create a lot of extra work, not only for you in the department, but also a lot of extra work for the buyers and procurement, and they also require a lot of additional documentation and time. Of course, like I said earlier, I know that life happens sometimes and a change has to be made, but in general, there are situations where it's better just to cancel an order and create a new one. So it's always good to talk to your supervisor, talk to your department to figure out the best plan of action if you have a change order that may require more significant changes. But let me go back to Aggie Enterprise for a moment because I do want to show you the withdrawal option because this is a pretty cool option that allows you to go in and update one of the ones that you previously started. So if I go back to my requisitions here, let me go back into this. Actually, I want to go back to my card here. And let me go back to the ones I created. Like that there, and put my name in. Here we go. So I got mine again here. And so what I want to do now is let's say I want to make a change to this one here, that cat tree. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. There should be an edit button in the upper right corner. Click on edit. It says right now, the requisition is pending approval. It will be withdrawn and removed from the approval process for you to edit. Click on edit. So what I've now done is taken this out of the queue from my approver and brought it back into my queue again in order to make changes. So let's say I want to change the quantity. I want to change it from 3 to a quantity of 6. One of our cats just had a litter. So there we go. So I've got my quantity here, and now I'm going to click on submit. It will again make sure everything is still okay with all the existing data. If all is good, it should then begin the routing process again. And I should get a little confirmation message on the screen, hopefully. Let's see here. Let me try this one more time. There we go. All right. So now it's been submitted. And again, so that would go back into the queue now of my approver. And then that person can then take action on that requisition. So moral of the story is if you create a requisition, you notice a problem, if the approver hasn't yet taken action, best thing to do, withdraw that puppy or withdraw that cat, make the change, and then go ahead and resubmit it. So a lot of the power is actually within your hands. And again, for any of you who are approvers out there, if you notice a problem, you can return it back to the initiator, and then they can make the edits and then resubmit that requisition. So that's the other thing I do want to mention is if you have a requisition with multiple approvers. So let's say I've got a requisition with 8 approvers. 7 of the approvers have taken action, and the 8th one returns that requisition. Once the initiator makes the change, yep, you guessed it, we'll have to route back through all 8 of those approvers again. So moral of the story is, routing is what it is, and that's what it is. Let's move on here. Other considerations. So let me stop again for a minute because I know I'm giving you a lot of information and I know we've got a lot of great questions and I've got my wonderful team, including Mark, I know who's been helping. And thank you again, Mark. I didn't give you a shout out at the beginning, so I want to make sure I give you a shout out as well. And let's see how we're looking in terms of questions right now. Great, thank you.
I was just responding to Paul's question about, can I copy a requisition that was created by someone else last year?
Yes, very good question.
Yeah, so we just recently, I believe it was last month, had the new user interface where the view that you're seeing now that Jim has on the screen is our new view in the requisitions. Any requisitions that were created in the old view, so prior to September, what was the date, Jim? Do you remember when the new
September 22nd. So
Thank you.
about 2.5
Yes.
weeks ago now. Yeah, time flies.
Yeah, so anything that was created before September 22nd, if you try to copy it to create a new requisition, it will fail because there's a coding issue on the back end that's not allowing them to go from the old UI to the new UI. But going forward, and this is what our recommendation has been for those of you we've already met with one-on-one, is create the requisition, and then you'll be able to use that one to copy going forward. But what you'll
Yes.
need to do, and thank you, Jim, is bringing this up here. So I'll let you take it from there, Jim.
Thanks, Jen. No, absolutely. I'm glad you've already met with people about this. So yeah, this is the other big question that comes up. And this one's really critical because normally what happens is my example earlier where I said I was going to be out for 2 weeks on vacation. So someone else is filling in on my behalf. And so maybe they want to use one of my existing requisitions. So what they can do is do a search, find the one I created, then click on reassign. When they do reassign, you can then reassign it to yourself. Just do a search on you, or in fact, I need to do my last name. And then I find myself in the system, I hope. Should have me in there. Let's see, is it not? Well, we are in the test environment, so they do scramble the name. So I will just have to tell you how this works because we're in the test environment. What you would do is find yourself. It almost sounds like it's a spiritual experience. You need to find yourself. And then once you click on reassign to put your name there, you don't need to notify the assignee because that's you, obviously. Then click reassign. And then once it's assigned to you, then what you'll be able to do is go in and make an edit to it. Then you'd have the ability here on this, there would actually be an edit option that would appear that would then allow you to edit it. So basically the two-step process is click on this, click on reassign, find yourself, which again, I know sounds funny. Let me try it one more time. I'm not sure why I'm not coming out. Let me try another person here. Yeah, it's not working for some reason. All right, we won't worry about that. But in production, it does work with the caveat that Jen had talked about earlier. So reassign, and then you can make edits to it. And of course, you can always edit any of your own. And the other thing that some people will do too, by the way, is in my example earlier where I was going on vacation, let's say, I know I'm going on vacation next week. I can reassign requisitions to you ahead of time. So if I want, I could go in and say, okay, Joe, I'm going to be out next week. Do you mind, taking care of these requisitions for me while I'm out? And then I can go in there and then go ahead and reassign those requisitions to Joe ahead of time. That way they're already there for him, and that can help as well. So gives you lots of options to work with in the system. And we do have a guide on that as well. It almost sounds like a broken record after a while, but we do literally have a step-by-step guide for almost anything. So let me check in again. Any other questions right now? Sounds like the folks behind the scenes are doing a great job of answering them. And I really
Jim,
appreciate
I
it.
just really like to stress, again, I know you just said it, but every process you covered today, every question that came up is all addressed in the KBAs or in a short how-to video, or even in some of the longer format videos. So you won't maybe remember all this when you go back to your desks, but you will have these resources available to you all the time. And also office hours. 3 days a week, we're there to drop in for any questions you have. Some people like to just come and listen to the other people's questions, but if you run into any issues that you can't figure out from the training, please come. It's a quick, easy way to get your questions answered.
Thanks, Crystal. Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot. And it looks like Teresa, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm certain that I will be using a bunch of KBAs and videos.
Yeah.
But what I think I'm concerned about in moving from pre-purchasing to doing this ourselves is that my pre-purchaser basically was the prompt when I needed weird stuff that I didn't know I needed. So I would say, hey, I want to set up, I've got this thing with this supplier. I've talked to them. They've given me this quote. I know what I need. here's what I've got. And then she would say, okay, but you also need a small business certificate, and you also need this kind of insurance document, and you also need this thing. And that was
Yeah,
fine. And then I went and found them. I don't know, like, because that's like 27 things on
right.
27 KBAs. I'm concerned about how I know that. And so I guess my question for you is it better to try to put together a requisition and send it in and let somebody on your end write me back and say, you are missing these 4 things? Or do I just show up to office hours every time I do a requisition and ask that question there? I'm happy with
Yeah.
either anyway. I just want to know for you guys,
Oh
what is
no,
the
yeah.
best plan for, because I
Ex-
want to get the right stuff. I just don't know how to find, like,
oh,
that's a lot of
absolutely. No.
things.
Yeah, that's all right, Teresa. No, that's why we're here. So, first of all, one of the KBAs I would highly recommend, and Crystal may already be putting this in the chat, is we do have one on attachment requirements. And so that one goes into a lot of the questions that you were asking about. So, for a lot of these purchasing transaction types that require attachments, there's, like you were saying, like liability or insurance forms or small business or conflict of interest and all these fun things. So yes, that would be the one thing I would start with, is reviewing that knowledge base article. I will show you where that is in a couple of minutes here as well for everybody. But that lays out like what you need for a lot of different types of purchases. It is, yeah, that's always the hardest thing for new people is, in today's session, obviously, what I'm giving you is more the high level. Here's how the system works and showing you some sample information. But believe me, I mean, you people get, obviously, we've got buyers that have, advanced degrees in purchasing and procurement management, because these things really do get into the weeds, into the legal issues. And so, to answer your other part of your question, Teresa, in addition to that knowledge base article for the attachments, I would also encourage you to come to office hours regularly. What a lot of people do is we have a regular contingent of folks that will come to office hours and just listen in. So you don't have to come to office hours, and this applies to everybody here. You don't have to come to office hours with a question. So if you want to come to office hours, some people will sit there and just be working on the side or whatever and listening to the different questions that come up. A lot of people find that's a great way to learn something new, or they might find that they're experiencing a similar problem or issue. And so I would encourage that as well. And then, of course, the other thing too is the third part is, yes, to answer the other part is, when you submit a requisition, if it's missing something, you will get it returned, like by a buyer or something. Now, of course, the buyers don't like doing that, because, of course, that means it slows down the process for you and for them. But they will work with you. Our buyer team is wonderful. They have a million things in their queue, just like you do. And so they're doing the best they can to move as quickly as possible with the limited resources. So, that being said, though, I think between the attachment KBA, the knowledge base article, the attending office hours, even if you're just listening passively, not actively engaged, and then like I said, the system and the approvers will let you know if you're missing a requirement. And like I said, I'm not a certified procurement manager. I'm just a communications guy. And I know enough to be dangerous. So there are situations too where I can help guide you in some cases. But my main role here within supply chain is to ensure that the resources are available, and more importantly, that the resources answer the questions you have. So hopefully that long-winded answer gave you at least some of what you're looking for. And of course, if it doesn't, feel free to reach back out too.
That's great. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. All right. And so we're at 10:30, so I want to finish. I only have a few more slides here, and then we'll give you plenty of time for more Q&A. I wanted to talk about a few other things a little bit outside of Aggie Enterprise, but let me start with the third bullet point first, because this actually is in Aggie Enterprise. There's something called Candex, and apparently there's a couple of different Candex things out there. This is not the antifungal tool. There's apparently an antifungal product out there called Candex, but this is a payment solution for one-time research participants, honoraria, and fellowship payments. So if you are being asked to make a payment to someone who is participating in, let's say, a clinical trial here at UC Davis or at the health center, or if you're paying someone a non-employee honoraria. So this honoraria is not for an employee, but for a non-employee honoraria. And generally speaking, for those of you who don't know, Honoraria is often identified like as a one-time, like a guest speaker, like a reward or kind of like a honor, because we're, happy that they're coming to speak with us here at UC Davis. Sometimes honoraria may happen like in a situation where you've got a guest speaker coming to talk to a class that's commencement speech, that sort of thing. It's also used for some fellowship payments. So Candex is one of our newer tools used for that. There's also the payment request form. So, what happens if you're asked to pay for something, but it's not something that you would normally create a purchase order for? So that could include things like a payment for a utility. So maybe you have an off-campus location and you're required to pay like a local utility bill, PG&E bill, something like that, a SMUD bill for those of you in Sacramento. And so those types of payments can be done via the payment request document. There's also on this form requires billing and specific information on what is being requested for payment. So keep in mind that this form, just like the requisition, will prompt you for what it is you're making a payment for. It will ask you, there's basically a drop-down option that you can choose from. And then when you're done with that form, it's emailed over to accounts payable. There's an email address on the form, who then reviews the request before processing the payment in Aggie Enterprise. So basically, the payment request is the go between the department and Aggie Enterprise that gets processed by our accounts payable folks. You may hear sirens in the distance, but they're not taking me away at this time. That being said, that form does get used quite a bit for a lot of your non-purchase order payment types. And if you've got questions on that, believe it or not, we do have a knowledge-based article on that as well. And we also have our accounts payable team that can answer questions about that too. And our accounts payable team is also at our office hours every Tuesday and Thursday from 11 to noon, and Wednesdays from 10 a.m. to 10:45. And then last but not least on this screen, and then we'll do some more Q&A, is the procurement card. And my understanding is a lot of you probably already know what the procurement card is or have a procurement card. But basically, what the procurement card is a credit card that can be used for purchases of supplies. It's assigned to you for business use in the department under that automatic purchase order limit. So the procurement cards are good for purchases up to the $99.99, so under $10,000. Generally speaking, we always encourage people to look for what they need first in the Aggie Enterprise system in the catalogs. But if you can't find what you're looking for, then you can use that procurement card to purchase those supplies under the APO limit. Again, that automatic purchase order limit of under $10,000. And then the other thing you can't use the procurement card for is capital assets. And those are currently at $5,000 and above. Procurement card, we won't really do a whole discussion on that today because that's a little bit outside the scope of this particular presentation, but can be a really good option when the catalogs don't have what you're looking for and you need to purchase some much needed supplies for a lab or a classroom space and that sort of thing.
And Jim, if I can
Yes,
interrupt you.
sure,
So
please.
you all know I'm our campus card program administrator, so I'm very much in support of using the P card. I'm happy to meet with any departments one-on-one. I'm happy to set up side meetings where we can all get together and talk about the card. Robert Fisher, if you've worked with him before, you know, is phenomenal and he's very knowledgeable. So anything that you need procurement card related, you can reach out to cardprogramhelp@ucdavis.edu.
Thanks, Jed. I appreciate that.
Thanks.
All right, just a few more slides here, and then we will get into more questions and answers. So let me bring some of these up because these are going to be great resources. So the first one is this new to purchasing page. So if you've never been to this page, again, we'll be sharing this PowerPoint with you, so you'll have all these links as well as the recording. New to purchasing, this has literally everything you need in order to get set up. So this talks about getting set up with your access, which some of you I know already have that step down really well. Also, we have email list. Both Crystal and I here in her office this morning, we are in charge of the SCM newsletter and the Procure Info email list. I guess we're both a bit biased, but we both think these are the best email list on campus, for sure. And then those are sent out regularly. The email newsletter is once a month, and this includes lots of tips and tricks. You can always reach out to either myself or Crystal if you want to get on that list. You can also recommend, and we bookmark the Aggie Enterprise Supply Chain Management website. I know some of you before today have already done this next one, the Purchasing 101 online training. This is really good training because it talks about why the heck we do what we do at UC Davis. Because sometimes people will say, gosh, it seems so gosh darn complicated, and can't we make it easier? And believe us, we are doing everything we can to make it easier. But there are a lot of regulations and requirements and restrictions and funding limitations. So this talks about those. And then those videos I was talking about earlier, we do have catalog purchasing, non-catalog purchasing, and we will have some new in-person basics classes, again, in-person classes coming up in November and December. Those will be announced this Wednesday on our supply chain management newsletter. So again, that's a little advertisement for that. So if you're not on our email newsletter, you can also email us directly, scmcomms at ucdavis.edu. And I hear Crystal, and I'm sure that's what she's putting in the chat right now, because we are like in this, this sync right now. I mean, in sync, not in a sync. And we're not in the band either, for what it's worth. I know that's a very old dated joke because a lot of people probably don't even know who NSYNC are anymore, which makes me feel ancient. All right, so then we also have information here on the procurement card. We have information on the Aggie Enterprise requisition. We have the office hours. So as Crystal mentioned a few moments ago, everything we're talking about today is either available on this page and or this page. So this has everything related to Aggie Enterprise. The website is aggieenterprise.ucdavis.edu. There is a section specifically on supply chain, and you can get here specifically by clicking on the modules option and then clicking on supply chain. And then you'll notice here that you've got all these various resources down below. So I mentioned earlier, there are videos. There are videos on how to search for agreements, how to understand your purchase order status and the buyer assigned to an order, how to log in, how to set up those preferences, how to window shop, how to shop from the catalogs, how to do non-catalog. These have all been updated within the last 3 weeks. They are all literally hot off the press. They are really good. We've vetted them not only with some of our current users of the system, but we also, before we roll these things out, we always have a lot of our folks who are newer to the system check them out to make sure that we're not assuming or missing any steps. And then your job aids. Now, this, if you only need to bookmark one section, this is it. Creating the requisition, all the steps. What happens after the requisition is submitted? Other resources. One of the other resources here, in fact, I want to mention this one too, to go back to Teresa's earlier question about, how do I know what to do when I'm purchasing lots of different things? I'm going to show you one other good resource for that. We also have receiving and accounts payable resources. Resources on supplier management, so how to search for suppliers. And then, like I mentioned earlier, a whole section here just for those of you in charge of approving things. So when you aren't sure about, what I need to do before I approve something, here's things you should be reviewing, then how to actually take action, how to actually approve those requisitions and those invoices. Now, to go back to that earlier question, this is the guy I almost forgot about, and I'm one of the people who created the darn thing, so I should advertise it more. This is probably one of my favorite resources, how to buy. So there are so gosh darned many nuances when it comes to purchasing things. And that is probably the hardest thing to learn is, again, you kind of figure out how the system works. You see the catalogs and that sort of thing. You learn the functionality, which is great. But how the heck do I know what I need to do and when I need to do it? So this how to buy guide is pretty extensive. So what we've done here is put together a list of some of the most commonly procured goods and services, and we put them together here based on what requirements are needed. So it talks about whether you need to use Aggie Enterprise, whether you need to do a payment request, whether you can do this on a non-catalog order, whether this is something that you shouldn't be doing. So we have all kinds of step-by-step information here. So most goods, we talk about purchasing things like accessibility tools, purchasing software, alcohol, tax-free alcohol, purchasing alcoholic beverages, like maybe you're going to have a dinner event or a reception, animal feed and bedding, animals themselves, biorepository services. There are many things on here for which I wouldn't even be able to pick them out of a lineup. Bottled water services, calibrations, capital assets, charter buses. So anyway, you can see that this really gets into a lot of different resources and different types of items. Dry ice, electrical items, flooring, food, gift cards. And we're always adding to this list. So to go back to the earlier question regarding, I'm new or I'm, kind of concerned about the fact that there are so many things I need to do. And when do I need to know what I need to know without needing to know it before I know it? This is probably the best page to refer to because this talks about what's required in a lot of different scenarios. So again, this is the how to buy page. And Crystal, I'm assuming you may have already put that in the chat as well.
Busy answering.
Oh, you're answering questions. Well, shoot. Well, I won't bug you anymore, but we will make sure we'll make sure you also get this link afterwards because like I said, I personally have been very involved in this page, so I take pride in it. And also, I do take pride in it for two reasons. One, because I think it helps, but also I want you to use it because if anything on there is not accurate, if you find a broken link, something that conflicts, or you think there's something else that should be added to that page, that's the kind of stuff I want to know about. So you won't bug me if you use the page and you discover a problem. I'm hoping you use the page and don't discover a problem, but not using the page is a problem. So I definitely encourage folks to use this resource whenever you can, because not only does it cover Aggie Enterprise, but as Jen just talked about a moment ago, we also have our card program. We have the procurement card program. We also have another program for the travel and entertainment card program. Aggie Expense was another one of our systems that, again, we're not covering in today's session, but that's another system that we oversee that also has online training available. Let me go back here to make sure I have covered everything I wanted to. Okay, the knowledge base articles, I talked about those. Again, the office hours. Again, these are good for more immediate assistance. We do have an online help form. So if you have a question, but it's okay waiting a day or two for an answer, the help form is your way to go. But if you're looking for a more immediate answer, or if you have a problem, you're running into a problem with the vendor or getting a form, signed or something like that, by all means, we encourage you to visit us online either Tuesday or Thursday. You may have even seen it just popped up here on my screen. In 15 minutes, we will actually have our office hours, which is pretty cool. So for those of you who are thinking you're going to leave with burning questions today, you can actually head over there in about 15 minutes. And then I think at this point, I have this slide, which means that we are at that point now where we will open it up to general questions. And I know I've got a wonderful team here. I know Crystal's been answering questions, and Mark and Jen. I'm sure Joe has been answering questions as well. I appreciate everybody who's been helping on this regard. Let me open it up now. I'm going to stop the share